Hello, my friends, and welcome to The Trace. I'm Andrew Thomas Hackett. I'm your host today. We've got a really cool episode. I'm so excited to share this. This is with Dr. Schermer Sellers, who's a marriage and family therapist and in the faculty at Seattle Pacific University. I saw her speak at Seattle University in the last 2 years, where she gave a whole talk related to her book, which is called Sex, God, and the Conservative Church. And Dr. Sellers has been working on research related to sexual shame, and sexual shame specifically related to religion, related to evangelical Christianity, and abstinence-only education. I was really excited for us to be able to sit down for an hour and a half and talk about all of her research and the work that she does, but also a few specific films and how her read on those and my feeling on them as well. We looked into Robert Duvall's The Apostle, and then 2 films by Todd Haynes, Far From Heaven and Carol. And these movies, combined with her research and her work, led us to some fantastic conversations that I really hope will be as cool for you as this talk was for me. So here we go. Today we're going to talk with Dr. Schermer Sellers here on The Trace. Let's get going.
I have been more, not nervous, anxious, but more like anxious, because I'm always saying to people, don't ever put me on your trivia team if we're going to go to details or names. Or
You're on the appropriate movie. It's still, I don't even like to think of it as a movie, even though I use movies.
Yeah.
But really it's just, it's about, I wanted to start something where I could have intense conversations with people, but open.
Yeah.
And about all the hard things.
Right.
And,
which is so fun.
Yeah, and movies just seem like they help people.
Yeah.
Like go to those
Launch
places.
pad.
Yeah. And it's a way to find a shared experience, you know?
Right. Yeah.
So.
One of my dear friends has one called Holy Writ, which is she interviews people, same kind of idea, but they read a book together, or it's somebody's written word. Yeah. And it's a great
Fantastic.
launching pad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we don't have a lot of spaces for these kinds of talks.
Right.
You know?
Yes.
I'm a bartender, so I get to do them in that kind of a context a lot.
Uh-huh.
And every once in a while somebody's like, you're not supposed to talk about politics
X.
or religion, and then add sex, race, class.
Right.
Like, you're not supposed to talk about those things. And I remember thinking, who doesn't want us to talk about those things?
Right. Yeah. Right. And
only the powers that be that would not benefit from people communicating.
Or we're supposed to dance around things just because they're difficult.
And
not
that's
learn
led us
how right to where we are now.
We are,
yeah, exactly.
Because we don't know how to have beliefs and be open to the other.
Right.
Or to being threatened.
Yeah, or to navigate challenging conversation. Like, we've lost the skill set of how to navigate challenging conversation because we don't do it enough.
Yep.
So then we don't stumble and go, oh, I could do that differently next time, right? And develop the skills.
And I've learned that the hard way.
Yeah.
Where, I offend someone. And
Sure.
and then you go, what am I projecting here?
Yeah, exactly.
And then where's somebody else, their defense is going off in a way that's not really actually great.
Or about you, right? And you can go, oh, wait a minute, that probably wasn't about me.
And then when's the stuff that I don't understand about myself coming out that I'm not even aware of?
Right, exactly.
Dr. Schermer Sellers.
Yes.
It's great to have you on The Trace.
Thank you. It's so great to be here. Thanks for having me.
I saw you speak at Seattle University at the Search for Meaning.
Okay, great.
And got your book.
Ah, cool.
And the things that and I went with my partner who did not grow up evangelical.
Okay.
And it completely, nothing, didn't even know about it.
Yeah.
Secular.
Yes.
And we were both, we had such good talks. And I think she understood some more,
About you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, but could you just kind of tell people like what you're really focused on with your, what you study, what you teach, what you investigate?
Yeah. So I've been a marriage and family therapy professor and medical family therapy professor for almost 30 years. But during that time, one of the courses that I have taught has been the human sexuality course for graduate marriage and family therapy students. And that's a required course for licensure in the state. And over the course of that time, one of the assignments I have the students do is write their sexual autobiography. People usually hear that and they think, oh my God, I can't imagine ever committing my sexual story to paper, right? And yeah, that's a pretty scary thing. But if you're going to be a therapist, you want to know the stories of your life. Mm-hmm. And that's because you want to know where you begin and end, and you want to know where your client begins and ends, mm-hmm. so those things don't get confused in the room. Mm-hmm. And when therapists haven't done their self of the therapist work, then their stuff does get mixed up with their clients, and they can become very ineffective therapists at best, hurtful therapists at worst. Mm-hmm. So throughout their program, they write stories about their life. So they could be doing stuff on family of origin, studying those theories, and they will write pieces of the story. They'll be studying gender, they'll write pieces of their story around gender, so that kind of thing. So they get to my class, and that's one of the things that they do. So I've been teaching that class since like 92. And so I give them, 60, 70 questions to kind of guide them as mm-hmm. prompts. They don't answer them one by one, but they do walk them through their family, their family of origin and their childhood, adolescence, their adulthood, etc., and ask them to think deeply about how they learned about gender and sexuality and their relationships. And what I've learned is people have on a scale, have very similar experiences. They develop on a timeline, a developmental timeline. They become curious, play doctor around the same ages, experiment with friends, same-sex friends mm-hmm. around the same ages, mm-hmm. Become curious about an other around the same ages. About the same percentage of people experience trauma of sexual abuse, childhood sexual abuse, or abuse from an other around the same ages, So, and about the same percentage. So, I've seen, sort of trends, and those trends stay very similar. Right around the year 2000, I began to notice a significant shift in tone of the stories that I was reading. And what I noticed was there was this shift in the amount of humiliation and disgust that people felt towards themselves as they were telling their story. And I couldn't figure out what was happening. Like, they were telling the same similar types of stories that I had always heard people tell. Like got in trouble for playing doctor or whatever, still people were growing up in silent and shaming homes. And that's about 90% or more of people that grow up in silent and shaming homes. We haven't really had good sex education. We had a little bit of it in the 60s and 70s, and then it really began to drop off. But this real deep increase in shame, and I couldn't put my finger on it, and it was devastating because the way it was playing out in people's lives, or their self-condemnation was so great that they were thinking of themselves as really damaged goods. And it was affecting their ability to partner with other people, or when they did partner with other people, the way they thought about themselves as like gross and disgusting or perverted. They would go underground with their sexuality and get involved in things that they felt horrible about, or they would manifest erectile dysfunction as men, or pelvic pain disorders as women. And this would last far into their partnerships if they partnered, or they wouldn't be able to date at all because they just thought of themselves as either disgusting, or some of them who were involved in conservative religious backgrounds would be like, I can't date, I can't touch, I can't do anything, I can't think about sexuality, I can't want sexuality. So it went not just to I can't have sex until marriage, but I can't actually think about it. I can't desire it, and I can't do it. And it went all the way not to just intercourse, but I can't hold hands. I can't kiss. I can't anything. And since they were told these things from a very, very early age, it was like pre-adolescent age where they believed that this was possible, which of course it isn't possible. It's like breath. You will have a download of hormones that are going to happen. Boys between 13 and 15 have 20 times the amount of testosterone that downloads in their body. You're supposed to turn on. You're supposed to go from a bicycle to a rocket ship. You are. And this is normal. But they didn't know. No one was telling them that this is normal. And so the only thing they could believe was that something was powerfully wrong with them. So my religious kids, my kids that grew up in religious homes, they were especially affected. But eventually what I found out was that a lot of the kids that also did not grow up in religious homes but were being affected by the abstinence-only education that was by the early 90s had really swept the country were also affected.
In public schools.
In public schools, yeah. So it took me a while to figure it out because the kids were just telling their story. I didn't understand what was happening underneath the story. They were just describing themselves, how awful they were. I didn't know why they felt so awful. So I had to dig deeper with them and find out what was actually happening in your environment. And so that's when I dug down and found out what had changed environmentally for them. And learned about for the kids in the evangelical conservative Christian homes. I learned about the rallies they were going to. I learned about what was happening in their youth groups. I eventually figured out what was going on with regard to the abstinence-only education programs and kind of pieced it all together, and learned that that's how sexual shame became much more rampant. This was happening at the same time that we were also getting rid of all of the regulations. The Federal Commission on Communication was getting rid of all of their regulations, and we were beginning to show so much more erotic material on movies and on TV and that kind of thing. And so at the same time, they were getting shown all this other information about women are objects, and you can do whatever you want with them. So it was very confusing time.
Hypersexuality of young teenage pop stars.
Yeah. And very narrow defined ways in which women can be and very narrow defined ways in which men can be. Men had to be much more aggressive, much more ripped, a very narrow defined ways of being. And women, the only way they got their power was through their physicality and power through connecting with men. And so they were getting a very narrow defined way of being too. And this was all happening, beginning mid to late 80s and then just ramping right up through the 90s and the 2000s. And this is when my kids were then hitting adolescence in the early 90s. And so that's what I saw. So this became something I then switched my whole career really to focus and do research on, because the effect was so profound on their lives. It affected their ability to partner and attach. And so when you affect people's ability to give and receive love, then you affect the rest of their lives.
Shame.
Yeah. Sexual shame. And it's profound. I mean, sexual shame, I don't know how you affect somebody's life more.
Do you have, a definition I heard one time between the difference between guilt and shame?
Right.
That was helpful to me was guilt is feeling bad for something you've done. Shame is feeling bad for who you are.
Right, exactly.
Is that how you would use those terms?
Yeah, exactly. So guilt is when you violate your own personal ethic. You have your own ethic. And so probably by the age of 3 or 4, you have an idea of something maybe you don't want to do. It might be a little bit older. I'm actually I don't know that I've thought about that on a developmental scale, but or life stage, but you begin to have ideas of things you don't want to do. And you violate that. So you begin to have that feeling like, I did something I don't want to do. I feel badly. And so guilt actually is motivating of change.
Yeah.
Shame is when you get in trouble for something that you naturally do, that you have no idea why you're getting in trouble. And sexual shame, I believe, is one of the first shames that we can feel. And that's because we recognize our hand as attached to us. So little infants, 2, 3, 4, 5 months, they don't know their hand is attached to them. And so they're hitting their face, and they're like, who hit me? Like, who just poked me in the eye? They don't know their hand is attached to them, right? And so parents are always like, be careful, moving their hand away from their eye or whatever. They're putting it in their mouth. About 8 months or so, they start to realize this hand is attached to them. And about 9 or 10 months, somewhere around there, as they're getting their diaper changed, that hand is going to land right on their penis or right on their vulva. And they're going to go, oh, there's a place down there that has lots of nerve endings. And this feels really good. And they're going to begin to make an association in the bath or as they get their diaper changed. And that association is going to grow. Somewhere around that time, if that parent is not comfortable with that, that hand gets slapped away. The first time that that movement or that don't happens, that child begins to make the association. I don't know why my parent, and this is obviously pre-verbal, just got angry with me, but this person that I love more than life itself just was angry. That's bad. And not that's bad, but I'm bad. Because I have no idea what I did.
Yeah.
Now, you can imagine a child is going to do this a million times. And then they're going to be in the bathtub, and the little guy is going to be on his tummy with all of his toys and his mask, his little diving mask, and he's going to roll over and his penis is going to be erect, and he's going to go, mommy, 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 daddy, 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 come here, look at this. Is my penis always going to be this big? And if the parent's not comfortable, they're going to be like, don't talk about that. Right? Again, no clue. Why am I in trouble? Right? Hand's going to be in their pants. Little girl's hand's going to be in her pants when they're in the grocery line. Get your hand out of there. No idea, right? So this starts super early. The child has no idea, but it's happening all the time.
So it's not just like a major event that happens.
No.
Yeah, it's little over time.
But the child will remember the one when they're finally about 5 or 6 and they're playing doctor. That's often the first one that they remember getting in trouble for, because they're old enough now to log that memory. But they've often had several before that. And that's the parents' shame from when they were little, right? That they got from their parents' shame from when they were little. And this is the shame we pass down. But this is all normal. This is all developmentally right on task. And all you need is a parent to say, yes, honey, that's your vulva. And you have a place called the clitoris in there, and it has lots of nerve endings, and it's really normal. But we actually touch that when we are in our bedrooms or in the bathroom. And mommy and daddy, or mommy and mommy, or daddy and daddy, we touch ours when we're in the bathroom and our bedroom too. That's all. You just teach them the social norms that we have in our culture. That's all. You make it a no big deal thing, and you have a happy face on. Just like you do when you're teaching anything about sticking our hands in our ears or our nose or whatever.
Yep.
Same thing, right? No shame gets attached. But when you don't respond to a natural developmental task with normalcy, the only meaning that a child can make is that I must be bad because I can't figure out what about me, what I've done, because it's just the me that's acting. So that's the difference between shame and guilt.
So it's good for like people that are listening to kind of get a few things as we talk about these movies in relation to this. And
Yes.
so there's there's a cultural element. There can be which could include a religious element.
Yeah.
And then there's parenting, and there's guilt and shame.
Right.
Two different things.
Right.
And so all these factors are at work.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I would love to share with you, we an operational definition of sexual shame. We actually just did research on an operational definition of sexual shame, if you can believe that. I had a PhD student come to me like 4 or 5 years ago now and say, I've been following your work. I wanted to do my PhD on religious sexual shame. Got into the literature and found out we didn't even have a definition of sexual shame. So I have to do my doctoral research on that. And I'm like, I'm sorry about the religious sexual shame. It would be great if you did, because we have to start somewhere, and then hopefully someone else will pick that up, or you can spend the rest of your career doing the other. We need it desperately. We need to understand this. Nobody's been willing to pick it up and look at the impact, but the impact is so profound on people's lives.
And everybody knows it. Everybody knows it. I mean,
yes.
In our lives.
You feel it in your lives, and it's so profound. Even though I'd been working with this for like 30 years, to see it in black and white just rocked my world. It really did. It rocked my world. And I think that's one of the great things about research, is that it makes things real. Even though we can know it intuitively and we can see it play out in people's lives, something about seeing it in black and white legitimizes it for us. But I want to read it to you, because when we talk about these movies, we see it play out in the lives of these people, I think, so much. Sexual shame, excuse me, is a visceral feeling. So in your body, a visceral feeling of humiliation and disgust toward one's own body and identity as a sexual being, and a belief of being abnormal and inferior. This feeling can be internalized, but also manifests in interpersonal relationships, having a negative impact on trust, communication, and physical and emotional intimacy. Sexual shame develops across the lifespan in interactions with interpersonal relationships, one's culture and society, and subsequent critical self-appraisal. So what that's saying right there, and it goes on, but what I want to point out, what that's saying is, it first begins between, and like I was saying before, the child and an other. And then eventually it gets an inner critic going. And then it happens again between the child and another, and then it reinforces the inner critic, and that's the feedback loop.
Yep.
Okay? Furthermore, sexual shame reflects a vulnerability and a distrust in one's ability to make decisions related to safety and autonomy in sexual relationships. So in other words, we see this playing out with young women in particular. They'll feel powerful in every area of their life until they get ready to go out. And then they're putting down 3, 4, and 5 shots, and this is in research, because they don't feel like they have the right or the ability to keep themselves safe. And this is in the Me Too movement, right? This is sexual shame rampant across all of culture. In Peggy Ornstein's research, she interviewed 80 girls between 15 and 22. Only a few of them are from a religious background. This is what her research showed. So sexual shame is just not from people from conservative backgrounds. It's all the way through our culture. So when we don't provide sex and gender education, we make people fit into particular cultural norms that are defined by the white and powerful, then we don't allow then people to be educated and to know, and we don't teach consent, then we set people up for violence. right? And profound sexual shame that then affects people's ability to attach and bond and do intimacy, give and receive love for the rest of their lives, and do family successfully. So this has a profound effect on our whole ability to do community life, right? So, and I think we saw that in those movies that you picked out.
Reminds me of James Baldwin would talk about the terror of the flesh that white America seemed to have, that he didn't understand.
Yeah.
Like, why do you hate the body so much?
Right.
And I know you've talked about it, and it has to do with Platonic dualism. I know, and I totally agree about that. It also reminds me about horror films and the body. I did an episode with a friend of mine who's a writer, and we did just one about horror, like the psychology of horror films, and specifically body horror, which movies, which there's some, and it has to do. It's connected to this stuff, and there's
Interesting.
It's a physical manifestation of this inner state.
Interesting.
Yeah. Well, okay, so that's awesome. I love that. That's great.
It's powerful.
Thanks to everyone who did the work.
Yes,
to make
I
that
know.
happen.
That was Noelle Clark, and that was in 2017. And her work actually earned her the presidential citation that year.
That is fantastic.
Yeah, it's amazing work. Yeah.
So, right away with our first film, we're going to see someone who's got some gender and sexuality problems.
Yes.
And religious and cultural.
Yes.
And I'm just going to give people a quick. I don't think probably a lot of people have not seen this movie. It's called The Apostle, and it's Robert Duvall. He wrote it, he produced it, he directed it, he starred in it.
Yes.
Like, he paid for it because nobody wanted it to be made.
Wow.
Yes.
Wow.
And so I was afraid to watch this movie when it came out. I was still in an evangelical kind of world, and it seemed like it was just going to be like a movie showing how bad, Christians are or something. But then I realized, wait, these are all those pastors in the movie, they're all real. Almost everyone is a non-actor, just with the exception of Billy Bob Thornton and Miranda Richardson.
Right.
And a few others. Anyways, so Robert Duvall is a Pentecostal preacher, and he's going all over, preaching all over the South with real preachers who all helped him learn how to preach. T.D. Jakes helped him too.
Wow.
He's not in the movie, but
yeah.
And anyways,
he does a brilliant job. Yeah, it's brilliant.
So he's just going around preaching, and you're like, okay, it's taking you into a world that a lot of people probably don't know.
The South.
Yep.
Yeah, the Bible Belt.
And everything seems all right, and then but it ends up he finds out that his wife is in a relationship with the youth pastor. And when they're together, that there's some major problems, and that he's been obviously physically abusive at some point to her. Yes. But he doesn't want her.
Unfaithful.
Yes. And he doesn't want her to leave, and anyways, and he ends up accidentally killing this youth pastor.
Right.
When he's drunk. And he runs away, starts a new life, baptizes himself, and starts a church in this little town in Louisiana or Texas or something. Yeah. And then the movie is... It's weird because it's a very humanistic movie because these characters are all dynamic and not just good or bad or whatever.
Yes.
And the movie, I think, honors the tradition of that type of religious expression while looking into the problems, especially male. So, when you watch the Apostle, what are your first reactions and thoughts? What did you feel? What did you first get from it?
I felt the struggle of, on the one hand, the deep sense of calling that Sonny, who is the main character, felt on his life. And that, of course, had family of origin ties to it and all that. But he was a passionate soul, and he had this deep conviction, sense of calling on his life.
And the movie is so beautiful in the way it shows those parts when he's a kid in church. It's really, really wonderful.
It really is. And then the angst that's created in part because of the family of origin issues, because of patriarchy in the South, patriarchy just in general, but in the way that he is molded into be a man, what's allowed and what's not allowed, the anger that is allowed, the violence that is allowed as a man, the infidelity that really kind of is allowed.
Do you know the term inherent transgression? Have you heard that?
I haven't heard that.
It's an inherent I think it's a Freudian thing, but inherent transgression is when there are things that are said in the culture, whatever culture you're in, that are said, this is okay and this is not okay. And then there's something where you say this is not okay, but actually it's okay.
Yeah.
That's the inherent transgression.
Yes.
And that's what you get there, right? With
yes,
him.
absolutely.
And people would say, evangelicals would be like, no way, like we're totally against sex outside of marriage.
Yeah.
And there's an inherent transgression for men often.
Oh yeah.
Right?
Well, we're doing that right now. We have how many percentage of people, evangelicals, that are voting for Trump, and they would
81%.
say,
Yes.
they would say
white
that,
evangelicals.
Right, white. No, I know. White evangelicals and women too, and they would say that sex outside of marriage and assault on women, right?
Yep.
But they're supporting someone who is.
Yep.
And many of those men are also involved in those transgressions. So there was such an angst inside him, and I would say that the culture that he was in also did not make room for him to deal with it well.
That's right.
And so throughout the movie, I was aware of my own sort of sadness in his angst, and aware of how in our toxic masculinity that we still bear in our culture, there is still so much angst for men to deal with their own boxes of where they have angst between what the culture says they can be and who they really want to be. They're better. The better angels within themselves of who they want to be as a man, who they want to protect, who they want to take care of, and how they want to be in the world and how they want to navigate. He would have moments where he was his better self, and then he would struggle to stay that person.
How'd you feel when he's already in this town and away from his family? He meets a woman, who's like a secretary, and she's cool. She's a great actress, and they go on a date. What were you feeling during that? All their interactions.
I remember feeling a little protective of her, and there is this there is this thing in patriarchy called empathy. And it's where we extend empathy towards men in that kind of what did you call it? Transgression.
Inherent transgression.
Inherent transgression, right? And so feeling like, how much empathy was she going to extend, or how was he going to do with his own struggles there? So I just, I think that there was a part of me that was sort of, in that with their relationship.
They do a thing there where it's a good scene for looking at consent too later when he wants to go to bed with her.
Yes.
Because on the one hand, you can see, like, she maybe likes him a little bit.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
And maybe she would see him more.
Yes.
But right then, she does not want him to come in.
Right.
And he's like...
He's pushing it.
He's pushing it.
Yeah.
And too far.
Yes.
But, like... And then he,
Yeah.
But it's just how gnarly or just dynamic consent can be, I guess.
Yeah.
She... when he's like kissing her, it's pretty uncomfortable.
It is.
And yet in this film, there's scenes where, for example, there's the part with Billy Bob Thornton when he's going to take the church down.
Yes.
And he has this moment of beautiful acceptance of himself. It seems like
Right.
almost of. It's that scene is incredible.
Incredible.
Like
And
he does good works. Like
well, and he steps into his better self. I think in that moment, I don't even think of that as works. I mean, in that moment, he stepped fully into his faith.
Yes.
Fully into his belief of who he was as a called preacher, to the point that I will be here and I believe so much in my calling and I believe so much in my God that I will lay this Bible down and I will stand here. And if that means that this bulldozer goes over me, so be it.
yeah.
I mean, he was in his better self. And he could be, I think, in his better self when he was standing, quote unquote, with God. He just struggled so much when it was related, I think, to his sexuality somehow or his masculinity somehow. That's where it got murky for him.
The cultural self.
Yeah, maybe.
It reminded me of what was the evangelical pastor that it came out that he had was seeing like a homosexual prostitute, Craig something. I
Oh gosh,
but
I'm so
it was
bad
like
with
10 years ago. But I remember it was basically like he was the president of the Evangelical something association.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking right away, there's nowhere for this guy. What's he going to do? Like, what? There's no evangelical Christianity does not have a way for him to explore that part of himself. So also, say a character like him in The Apostle. Maybe is this the kind of man that maybe needs to be in an open relationship? Maybe, or is he just someone that needs to be able to date and have sex and then feel okay about it? But like, it creates such a problem,
Right.
when
Exactly.
your only option is
Right.
sex in marriage with a member of the opposite sex, and that's it.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Oh my goodness. I'm just so grateful that we are at a time now where we have open and affirming churches that are opening for those from evangelical or Protestant backgrounds, because they're leaving the church in droves and they're wounded as heck. And not just those that are LGBTQ, certainly those, for sure those, but many straight people,
Yep.
many straight people who are like, I stopped feeling at home here, 15, 20 years ago, because I felt othered. My story felt othered too. I had to keep so much of myself silent here too. And I loved so many people who were othered.
Yep.
And if they couldn't come, I don't want to come, So they've been churchless for so long, but now we have so many churches, and I speak at many of those churches around the country now, and I have made so many dear friends at those churches, and I know so many stories now, and I have a dear friend, Paula Stone Williams, who was very, very prominent in a large evangelical church plant organization for, 40 years, maybe 35 years, as white male, so very privileged. And at 62, in order to save her life, her wife said, "You need to transition." I mean, they had known for a long, long time, but the kids were grown and there were grandkids, and there was now nothing going to keep her alive. And so she did, risking everything.
Yeah.
And in 8 days, because she worked for a religious organization, lost everything, including a gigantic pension. And you can go to Paula Stone Williams, her blog, and read about how she was treated.
Wow.
She has a TED Talk that has 1.7 1.8 million views, where she talks about living on both sides, being a man and now being a woman for several years, and what it's like to be treated like a woman in our culture. She says, I'll never outlive my male privilege, and I am shocked at how women are treated. But she's a beautiful female, tall, slim, just the things that women are held up to, right? And the way that she is treated, the mansplaining she has to do for the first time in her life. I mean, it's unbelievable, right? She and her son, Jonathan, just did a TED Talk last week. It was like $2,800 a seat in Palm Springs, talking about their story and what it was like. And he's a pastor at an open and affirming church. She's a pastor at an open and affirming church in Colorado called Left Hand. He's at Forefront Brooklyn. And their story is in the New York Times under a heading Family and Transition. But they just did their TED Talk last week. And when I read it, I haven't seen it yet, but when I read it, I cried throughout it because it's such a story of grace and redemption for a family to walk through this together, to kind of lose your father, but now we have churches like Forefront, like Left Hand, like Denver Community Church, like Highlands Church in Denver, like the Bar Church and East Side, community here in Seattle. And that is making all the difference. The church of All Sinners and Saints that Nadia Boltz-Weber in Forever. These places are wonderful, and people don't have to hide their story, right? And they can be exactly as they are. So if you're in that kind of church and you discover something about yourself, your entire family can come forward. So I have a dear friend, Josh Weed, who's in the LDS church, and he knew as a young man that he was gay, and he told his family, I'm gay. And his family said, that's fine. We love you. It doesn't matter. And I don't even think this had to be said, but you're not going to be able to live that out. So he knew he was going to have to live in a mixed orientation marriage. And so he got married and lived, and Lolly, his very best friend, knew that he was gay and that they would live in a mixed orientation marriage. So it was always that way. And they believed they could be absolutely happy in a mixed orientation marriage. They have 4 girls. They openly lived in a mixed orientation marriage. They were on 2020. They have a blog called The Weed. They were out there with it as a mixed orientation marriage. Lovely marriage. Worked harder than anybody I have ever known to have a very happy mixed orientation marriage. They together finally figured out, and I say finally, and I think that's fair to say, that Josh wasn't broken. He wasn't broken. But, he had been through bajillions amounts of therapy, therapy being like, quote unquote, these are big air quotes, like that conversion therapy, and came to a point where he believed that was baloney, and believed other gay and lesbian people weren't broken, but hadn't really applied it to himself until, I don't know, maybe 5 years ago. And then it sunk in that he wasn't broken. And it sunk into them together that they both deserved to experience real love. And together, they decided to divorce, but stay a family. Buy a big piece of property someday, have 2 houses, whatever. They are still living as a family. And she's learning to date, he's learning to date, and it's all on their blog for the entire world to see. I think it's shaking up the LDS church, frankly. But because they have allowed themselves this permission, they are learning how to do it. It's too bad that they couldn't do it from the beginning, but they are doing it as a family. And it's one of the most beautiful stories I know. We need to be able to raise our children to be exactly who they are and let them be who they are from the beginning. I
did a few years ago, after many years, decided to read some of the Bible again.
Yeah.
And I read Matthew, but I spent like months,
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
it. And then I did, I was like, okay, it's time for Paul. It's time to do it. I was scared. And I read Romans, 1 Corinthians, and Galatians, and months, and wrote endlessly about all it, and study,
Yeah.
But what I saw when I looked at Paul again was the entire project of the church, the early Christian church, was to create, because when you look at sexual ethics of the Roman Empire, that was shocking to me, because that's presented as some like liberated society. No, the consent was so messed up there, and all kinds of weird. It was all about power and hierarchy.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
And so the reason why those Christians, the early Christians, were so persecuted by the Roman Empire was because their society was built on hierarchy.
Yeah.
And the church was a space without hierarchy. Mm-hmm. And these spaces, these alternate spaces that were being created, were, as in Paul's, as he says, the place where there's no master or slave.
Yeah.
That's illegal.
Yes.
That's an illegal revolutionary action in the Roman Empire to not honor that. Their whole society is based on it. No male or female. No Jew or Gentile.
Right.
So that's an affront to his Jewish community.
Yes.
Right?
Exactly. But that's what Jesus stood for.
Yes. And so what you get, that the idea of this space is, as opposed to every other space that's power-based, the church space is one of equality.
Yes.
And it doesn't have anything to do with class or race or gender. That's just
anything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's amazing that somehow that got turned into
a Roman space.
Yeah, a system of power
Power.
Oppression.
Yeah.
Instead of liberation and possibility.
Yes.
And responsibility.
Yes.
Because later I want to get at the end, I think that the progression of these three films is on purpose. Mm-hmm. So with what you were talking about with the LDS couple, and what you said about Paula
Stone Williams.
Yes. Mm-hmm. That immediately I just thought, okay, Far From Heaven.
Yes.
Right.
Exactly.
So Far From Heaven, the last two movies are the same director, Todd Haynes.
Okay.
And Far From Heaven is about a couple in the 50s who are kind of on the wealthy side. He's a successful businessman. She's a successful housewife. And there's a problem, and that is that he's gay, and he's trying to repress it.
Yes.
And then she ends up, when this comes out, starting to form a bond with a African-American man. And that's a problem. Mm-hmm. And for the society.
Yes.
Okay. So with Far From Heaven, how about your first thoughts and feelings about that one?
Well, what struck me over the film was, I mean, obviously, Dennis Quaid's character, he struggles, he stuffs it down, tries to do reparative therapy of his own, which just, turned me inside out as well. It just was horrid. But they kept his a secret. Mm-hmm. Unlike Julianne Moore's character, who was the housewife, she formed this friendship with Dennis Haybert, and who was her gardener, and it was out of so much kindness and true friendship and innocence and awareness that maybe you're not supposed to, quote unquote, have a friendship with an African American person, but she didn't care. And that friendship grew, obviously, to become somewhat romantic. But she didn't move to hide it. Mm-hmm. And so there was an authenticity of herself, in herself, that was kept, even though that ended up costing her. And I thought that was an interesting juxtaposition in the movie, mm-hmm. because you have two different prejudices playing out in the movie. One about gay lesbian issues or gay issues, I guess, and homosexuality, and another about race, and two different responses to prejudice within the family. And I just, that's what struck me, actually.
And my like interpretation for why it's that way is because the way I see this Todd Haynes, he's one of my very favorites, and he's a gay homosexual man, and but he studied semiotics, and so he's all into all the postmodern gender theory and all kinds of.
Oh, cool.
But I think he's an existentialist. To me, I see Kierkegaard's understanding of faith and the self in these movies. And the relation, and that being when you have the sense, all these movies have a calling in them also. And when you get a call of some kind, your response to it, it's like Kierkegaard says, you're either offended by the call, or you kind of like live with it, but you don't commit to it, or you do the act of faith. That's the commitment. The commitment. Not to God, to a person.
Yes.
Or a cause.
Yes.
And so all these people, but Kierkegaard knows that there's some problems. One is that person you might lose them, or your cause could fail. But also, what your call, it might be an offense to your culture. Right?
Yes.
And those conditions you have to think about.
Right.
And I see that in Far From Heaven, like Dennis Quaid's character, he can't be with a man until he goes to Florida or something, right?
Right.
Like there's no way he can do it in his home. And she can kind of step into the water a little bit with the race issue. But as soon as it's going to go too far, they know that there's a limit to it. And so I see it as being like the hard choices that you have to make.
Oh, absolutely.
In these things, you know?
Oh, absolutely. They're going to lose standing in this very upper class society that they live in. You know, he's going to probably lose his job. You know, there's going to be some huge losses here, given that this was whatever in the 50s probably. You know, there's going to be some huge losses. Yeah.
And that's like the minister that you mentioned, that once they decide to transition, they lose their pension even.
Yeah, they lost. Yeah, and when you work for a religious organization, you can. You can't if you don't. It's against the law. But if you work for a religious organization, you can in the United States. You're not protected.
Do you know the name Lonnie Frisbee?
I do know that name. I know that name well, actually. Well, it's in my past life. My little sister worked for him at one point.
Really?
Yeah.
Whoa.
I know. Like I just reached back about 30 years or 35 years.
Because this is most people obviously do not know who Lonnie Frisbee is because he's been erased from his evangelical history.
Yeah.
But everything that's related to the Jesus movement, which most people don't know, had enormous ramifications.
That was
on
my
the world.
era.
Yeah, and that's what I grew up in from my parents. Like that's my tradition.
Yeah. I was just in the Jesus movement.
Lonnie Frisbee was basically one of the primary catalysts for this, and he was a young
up here
hippie.
in Seattle.
Yeah, well, he was first in San Francisco in like 68 something.
Okay.
He went down to San Diego.
Oh,
I'm sorry, L.A. Costa Mesa and he met Chuck Smith.
So I know Chuck.
Yeah, well, that's the Jesus movement from that Calvary Chapel.
Yeah,
and
Calvary,
it expanded.
That's where I was. Calvary Chapel.
It expanded from there. Really, its influence ends up worldwide.
Okay.
The influence of this. I've studied it a lot in the last few years, deconstructing my own tradition.
Interesting.
But Lonnie Frisbee, so he's this long-haired hippie. There's videos on YouTube of him, like on preaching.
Yeah.
And he was very charismatic with people. And but he was young, and he was used to grow this movement. And then because of his own sexual issues, or not issues, but whatever, with him, he ended up basically it ended up that he was either homosexual or bisexual, I'm not sure. But he died of AIDS, Lonnie Frisbee, in the 80s.
Okay.
And he also was very influential in the Vineyard.
Yes.
Growing, which is another Christian denomination.
Yes, I know.
For our listeners.
Right. Yeah.
And so anyways, it's another one of these people. if you don't fit into one understanding of gender and sexuality in this community, and not only that community, right? Many religious communities and many secular communities around the world too. If you don't fit into one, then there's literally no option. And what's the psychology of a human being when they have no option?
Exactly.
What do you do?
Right. You have no place to go.
And I know one thing you talk about too is these kids that grew up in abstinence only and weren't doing sex. They were like consuming pornography, but not in a way of like affirming or sex positive, but a pure shame and guilt.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And then making up stories about how awful, right? How awful they were, how perverted they were, and absorbing that fantasy as reality. It was their form of sex education. As the internet was coming on board, right? This is the mid-'80s.
It's not Playboy now. It's
all open, right? This is all now free pornography. So anything goes. And no one's helping them understand what's what.
Yep.
It's the male fantasy. And we were just, and we still are throwing our kids out there.
Yeah.
We're not providing any education at all.
I have an 11-year-old, and I need to it's time to have I try to not just the talk, but always,
please,
right?
Yeah.
But I do have to at some point address pornography.
Yeah.
So that it's not, because I don't want him to have the shame that I felt when I was a teenager, and even into my 20s, because I did the thing. I did the abstinence only till I got married at 27. So, and I know what a sham that whole deal is.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's just so helpful for kids to learn about, what pornography is, what it isn't, how free pornography is made, how ethical pornography is made, what's the difference. There is one really good documentary that Rashida Jones made called Hot Girls Wanted. And then she did a series after that. And it goes through, just teaches you a little bit about pornography. The series has, different parts of it, like here's free pornography, here's ethical pornography, here's different aspects of just sex work along the way, just to give you jumping off points to have conversation. All of it's just really good educational stuff. And then how is this different than what we do in relationships when we're trying to situate a relationship where there's a whole lot of stuff like maybe cooking dinner, maybe doing dishes, getting undressed. That all happens before this. And maybe there's the next morning when your hair's all over the place and taking a shower and going to work. Also that happens.
Yeah.
That might be different than this one scene, and that all is important too to talk about. And then talking about how we sell people, and that this is a form of how we run our economy is by selling people or using people to sell other things, but how that then feels as a person to be used as an object.
And the commodification of sex.
Right, exactly. And to then have that conversation with your kid. I love having that conversation because kids can identify what it feels like to be used. And I think we don't want to both use and we don't want to feel used. And so then how to be conscious of what that interaction looks like, either to do it or to have it be done to you. And then how to be conscious of that as we grow up as a pre-adolescent and adolescent, because you're going to be put in positions, especially as a boy, to be in bro culture. And you're going to be, come on, do that. Don't rat us out, And so how do you not do that when all your bros are going to do that? It's hard. it's, it can sound like, oh, I can do that, but actually it's really hard.
I had an experience once when I was probably 14 or something like that. I lived in Mexico. My parents are Christian missionaries.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're in Mazatlan, Mexico, and I was with my best friend. We went over to his friend's house, who I didn't really like that much, and because bro culture. And there were some other guys there. They were like a little bit older than us, and they were like put on like pornography, like hardcore pornography. And I was just like, I don't want to be here.
Yeah.
I don't want to be in this environment. Like, how do I get out of here?
Yes.
And so I was like, oh, I'm going to head out, and they all started using gay slurs at me.
Yes,
right? And
exactly.
But I was just like, whatever.
Right, exactly.
Like, I mean, it was so, I wasn't even offended or anything. It almost felt actually like, I was so grossed out by the patriarchy. Not that I haven't been influenced by it as biological white male. But I hated it so much as a kid. Yeah. Always, my whole life. And so it was like, it felt really nice to be called gay slurs.
That's nice.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, yeah.
That's happened to me a few times in my life, and every time I felt like really warm and nice. When I was younger and there was no LGBTQ spectrum when I was a teenager, I wasn't aware of it.
Yeah, right. We weren't out enough then.
I'm sure Judith Butler was on it, or, different people like that, but... And so it was only the culture allowed me what I understood, not the evangelical culture, but the American pop culture, which I worshipped. Yeah. MTV and movies. Right. And I basically, in my brain, there was 3 options. You could be straight with your whatever gender you were assigned. Mm-hmm. You could be gay, or you could be bisexual, and that was it. Mm-hmm. And I was just like, I'm not in any of these. Mm-hmm. Like, what, I don't know what, and then gender, I was like, I had no idea. Mm-hmm. And so it was basically just like, my solution to this was, I'm an artist and I'm a spiritual person. Yeah. I don't know the rest, Yeah. And so it's so nice now to have a language for the fluidity of all these things.
Oh, it's so good.
And then it's not so... And in a way, I don't know how you feel about this, sometimes with the way we use, what's the word we use? Identity politics. Mm-hmm. There's something about me, too, that I personally choose to not identify in any of these categories. Mm-hmm. I don't care what someone calls me. It doesn't matter to me, Mm-hmm. That might be coming from a white male privilege, like as far as my culture and my biology, that I can do that. Right? I'm aware of that. Yep. But I like that when you see the idea of fluidity, I like that there's room to move, and then in a way you don't have to identify. Yes. And I think that's confused right now in our larger cultures a little bit.
I think it is. I think that there are some people who want people to identify.
Mm-hmm. On both sides.
Oh, yeah. Right? Oh, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that's kind of getting worked out. Yeah. I think often, from what it seems like to me, it has to do with their story and how much they struggled either to have an identity or to get seen. Yeah. And so I think as they come, what I've seen in some people's stories is as they've come to where that's become a non-issue for them, they also then begin to not care what other people do or how they do it. And so it's like, I no longer care because I feel seen and I am seen and I see myself. And I also don't care where you are and what you're doing. And
maybe it has to do with, because when I think about it, maybe it has to do with, we want to be seen in certain ways. And so for some people, the gender and sexuality could be a really important way to be seen. Mm-hmm. And for somebody else, like, for me, it's important to be seen as someone that's creative or that's thoughtful or that's kind, like those things. Mm-hmm. That's what I want to be seen as. And I don't really, other things I just don't care.
Right.
And it's like how you can get praised about some things, but if it's a value you don't value that much, then it doesn't really register.
Yes. Yeah, that could be.
You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense.
So the last film we have here is Carol.
Yes.
And the idea for me here in this movement is like the apostle, you have the religious pressure,
Yes.
influence,
Mm-hmm.
and what that looks like.
Yeah.
Far from heaven, it's not about religion. It's the culture, and it's capitalism, maybe even.
Yes.
Right? And
Yeah.
gendered things. And then here what blew me away about Carol, and Carol is literally, it's my favorite movie since, like, I don't know. It's so, I watched it again last night. The movie resonated with me so deeply. So deeply.
Yeah. Oh,
As much as I've ever
yeah.
experienced.
I'd love to hear about that.
But, so here we have Todd Haynes again, and now these cultural and gendered, there's not a religious aspect to the movie, cultural religion. But here the cultural factors are acknowledged, but these characters, specifically Rooney Mara, Kate Blanchett's worked it out, and Rooney Mara doesn't care, right? Like, as far as her cultural identification. She loves someone.
She loves someone.
Yeah. So when you saw Carol, what was that like for you?
I just, where I went with that movie is I was struck by the motherhood piece. That's where I got struck.
Sure.
That she was put in the position to choose.
Yep.
To me, that was just the heartbreaking piece. I got it. I mean, I understood it. Again, I think as a woman, as a mother, as somebody who loves deeply, it poked on that part of me that gets angry with patriarchy and power.
Yep.
She was a force. Carol was a force in her own right. But that she could be put in the position, because she was a lesbian, that she could be put in that position because the power was going to go to him as a white male, because he was the straight one.
Yep.
That she would be forced to choose. That he could, because it was the time in history that it was, that she could lose access to her daughter, was just infuriating to me. Yep. And I'm divorced and remarried. I have a blended family, so that also, there's pieces of me that can't resonate with being at a powerless place too. Yeah. I loved her character.
Yeah.
It was brilliant.
She has to make an impossible choice.
Yeah.
One of the things about, I like the way the men are presented in the movie.
Yeah.
In the sense that it's kind of like the apostle version.
Yeah.
Where these men are a part of the patriarchy.
Yeah.
They're shaming.
Yeah.
I feel like any other director, that husband would have hit her. Any other director.
Yeah.
But Todd Haynes will not have a villain in his movies.
Yes.
Ever.
And
And so you understand
yes.
the husband.
Yes, absolutely.
And you understand Rooney Mara's boyfriend at the beginning, that these are men that don't understand, and they're used to having power.
Yes.
And the fact that they cannot exercise their power here, to them is they cannot handle it.
No.
It's like a trauma or something.
Exactly. No, exactly. And they must do something. They must do something to exercise their power. They must. I get it. I absolutely get it.
And their only weapon ends up being shame, saying shameful things
Yeah.
to them, shaming them.
Yeah.
And then because he has this power, the husband, with the daughter, which is like the worst power you could ever use,
Yeah.
really, against someone.
Yeah. Exactly.
It's like, I'm not going to say the
Yeah.
movie is forgiving towards them, the men. It's like their dignity of a human being, not of a man, of a human, is present somehow, as painful and sad.
Well, we don't. We don't call out that kind of victimization. We don't call out the victimization of putting a child in the middle. Even though we know by research that you will emotionally hurt a child if you put a child in the middle like that. We call that parental alienation syndrome. You know, if in a case like that, which would have been, the 60s or whatever, a child would have literally be taken away from a mother and been told terrible things about, another parent. But he would have come out looking like the good, saving, protective father.
Yep. Which the movie does not allow you to see what the culture,
right?
Probably how the culture would have seen it, because here you're on the inside,
right? Exactly.
And you see how powerless he is and doesn't know what to do with it.
Exactly. And there's a line somewhere in there where she says, "We gave each other the most beautiful gift."
That's right.
It just makes me cry even to think about it. They had a good relationship. Again, it was the culture that placed them in this position of not being able to do what like Lolly and Josh are doing, not being able to figure out how do we family together. They familied well together. They did family. They loved this child well together. The culture wasn't allowing them the creative solution that they wanted. He said it shouldn't be this way. And she says, I know.
Yeah.
But the solution wasn't before them.
Yep.
Because of the culture.
Yep. The big move I see in Carol, there's two major moments for me in the movie where I reacted so. What's the opposite of a trigger? Like, not a trigger to a bad feeling, but a trigger to hope and love and like depth of feeling. The movie did it on all the way through. I cried the entire movie. But there's a scene when Carol realizes she can't see her daughter for a little while.
Yeah.
And she goes to see Rooney Mara, and she says, Therese, Carol goes to see Therese, and they're on the top of the building, and their relationship, they're friends.
Yes,
and
yes.
There's an obvious attraction, but they're friends at this point. And Carol says, I'm going to go away for a while. And Therese immediately is like really sad.
Yes.
And Carol says, do you want to go with me?
Yes.
And Therese says, yes. That scene, I was just like, ugh. That's like a Kierkegaard thing again about hope.
Yes.
And hope being not when you hope for something specific, but hope is an openness to good things that can happen.
Yes,
and it's hope for the even impossible.
Yes.
And there, something is happening for Rooney Mara that she wouldn't have imagined.
Yes.
She's falling in love.
Yes.
And all of a sudden, she has, because there's a class difference.
Yes.
She can go with her.
Yes.
Because she has money.
Yes.
And they go on a beautiful adventure.
I know. So beautiful.
And then the culture.
Yeah. Boom.
By the patriarchy, also the man who's like investigating them and scary.
Yes.
Yeah. But this is the reason why Carol goes to another level for me is all the way through that. I love it. It's great. It's 10 out of 10, masterpiece. But then it does something, and that's the Kierkegaard move into faith, because Rooney Mara, her character doesn't really know who she is yet. Like, she's falling in love.
Yeah.
But she's having another struggle. Right. Because she doesn't know what she wants to be in the world. And so then when they break up for the daughter.
Right.
She leaves her because she has to try and be with her daughter. Then Rooney Mara is devastated. And that part, poof. And then, though, she starts to do her photography, work at a newspaper, build a life, and build a confidence. And so at the end, Which,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, spoiler for people.
Oh, I know.
I won't say what the end is, I guess, but there's something in the end that is now
Yeah.
there's going into, when you can go into love
Yes.
with,
choice.
yeah, and with power, not power over another.
No. But with power with self.
Yeah.
And power with self-knowledge.
Yes.
Yeah.
Then she's going in. That's like the move of faith now. Like and I love that it ends. There's I wouldn't say ambiguity, but you know where it's going basically.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
that just summarized to me
Yeah.
what I was learning about love and commitment, because that brings us to like sex positive thinking,
Mm-hmm.
which and the big I tried to explain to someone authority figure in my life about sex positivity, an evangelical person, and how I think it's so much more helpful than abstinence only.
Yes. Well, it is.
It is. Because in sex positivity, consent and communication and boundaries are so valued.
Yeah.
And what all those means, it means that you have to think about what you want. You have to communicate it. You have to honor the other person. In other words, you have to take responsibility.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Well, and I want to say, and I say this to evangelical people who sometimes think that, they've got the upper hand on stuff. Like that's a terrible thing to say, but
The evangelical culture.
yeah, the culture, there is sometimes an assumption that there's a corner on truth. And it's a truth with a capital T. And when I was writing my book, I asked the question, did Christianity ever get it right? Did it ever have a sex positive sexual ethic out of Jesus' ministry, out of that flat hierarchy that everyone is welcome at the table, that is body positive, because Jesus was body positive, so that people felt loved and seen, seen, known, loved, and accepted, which is what you felt with Jesus, which is what you ought to feel in a loving experience between people, right? So I traced it back, couldn't find it anywhere, and saw that we developed a sexual ethic out of the mind-body split, which was in place through the denial of the body in the 4th century when Constantine was an emperor. And we've had that ever since, and women were around to blame, and women are still around to blame, right? So then I said, well, staying on the Abrahamic line, was there a sex-positive ethic in Jewish tradition? And there was a ton of beautiful Hebrew mystic and Hebrew scripture that very much shows that we have on the Abrahamic line this relentless God that uses sexuality symbolically and actually to show that love is communicated through physical touch.
Yes.
Yeah. And I found this one thing called the vow of Ona. And what I love about the vow of Ona is there are 8 different guidelines in the vow of Ona, thousands of years old. And you can use these guidelines to talk about consent, to raise your kids by, to run your relationship by, to run your dating life by. And I feel like we've been searching for these forever, and they've been there all along. And I'm like, well, why am I discovering these now? Why don't we know about these things? And if we applied these, we would have so many of our problems solved. So I'll read them to you just because I think they're just so cool. All forms of sexual touch are recognized and valued. 2, the purpose of all sexual touch is to reinforce the sexual bond over the lifespan. So that gets at the fact that Jewish folks know that the elderly are sexual.
Oh, yeah.
It's just known in the Torah. It's known all around. 3, sexual enjoyment is recommended even in times when procreation is impossible. So that includes the acts that you do or when you're pregnant, whatever. 4, sex is considered a woman's right and not a man's. And what is interesting to me about that is not, because it's very counter-Western, our thinking, but what I think is super elegant about that idea is that in a patriarchal culture like ours, and Jewish culture has been patriarchal too, is that if you raise men to think it's all about them, and if their natural proclivity is sort of about themselves, and you raise women to think it's all about them, and their natural proclivity is to take care of other, then what you have to wait for men to be sometimes in their late 40s or 50s to realize that it's relationships that make all their hard work make sense. And you have to wait for women to get to sometimes their 40s to start to realize that they have voice, that they want to say yes or no, that they have something to do in the world. Well, if you raise your kids by this kind of idea, then you have boys starting to pay attention to other right away. You know, well, what do you notice that he likes or she likes or that person likes? And you get them honing that skill, and you get girls paying attention to their voice and what they like and how they're being treated and how to speak and honing that skill. Then there's a chance that they can have an egalitarian relationship in their late 20s, early 30s, and have a much more egalitarian sexual relationship earlier on.
And this would maybe be like balancing some biological factors for the
right.
testosterone and stuff in young men.
And brain differences, like our hippocampus is different sizes and our amygdalas are different sizes, just enough that that it can trip us up in heterosexual relationships. So that balances that a bit. 5, sex is to be celebrated in joy, not in sadness, anger, disinterest, self-interest, or when chemically influenced. Sex for selfish or personal satisfaction without regard for the partner is considered wrong or evil. And that word evil is very rarely used in the Torah. 6, a man is never to coerce or force a woman to be sexual through emotional or sexual tactics. And so that one's directly given to men, and I think that's because of sometimes the size or power difference there. Sex is not to be used as a weapon against a partner either by depriving or compelling sex. It's a serious offense to use sex in any way to manipulate or punish a partner. And the last one, all forms of sexual touch are permissible as long as they're desired by both partners. And I love that because it gets to, we still have some states that have certain sexual acts on their laws that you're not supposed to do. Or I actually had somebody interviewing me, and I was getting ready to be on a radio show of hers, and she actually said that she thought that kink wasn't, you couldn't be a Christian and participate in kink, and I'm like, explain that to me, you know, like. Yeah. And then I told her this. I said, no, actually, if two people consent to something, and provided it's not going to, you know, be illegal, you know, or put someone's life in danger, no, it's fine.
Fair ground.
Fair ground, exactly. I said, it may not be good for you, so you have the right to say no to it, but no, it's fine. In fact, and so I love stuff like this, you know, and these are thousands of years old. So we actually, you know, so to be able to say to an evangelical, no, actually, thousands of years before, we've known how to do sexuality. And it's a way that we're supposed to understand God's love is through our bodies, through loving body, mind, soul, and spirit. It's where it comes together.
And that thing with, I mean, when you read the New Testament, the Gospels, and Jesus' attention to the body.
Yes.
And then of course the whole Bible's like enjoyment of food and wine.
Yes,
and all
pleasure.
It's a Greek problem, not a Jewish problem.
Yes.
Is our thing. And what you're saying reminds me of something that has become more and more like my own personal focus and goal, like with others when talking about these big subjects.
Yeah.
Wherever someone is on the religious spectrum or any of the spectrums, is looking for like openness.
Yeah.
And then taking responsibility for your
Yes.
choices
Yes.
and your desires,
Yes.
and communicating them, not just in sexuality, in everything.
Yes, in everything. Right.
And it's so nice to remind. I don't know. It's like there's something in our brains that wants to be able to close the door and define things and leave them closed. Like I've had so many people tell me things like Christianity is this, is this, is this, is this. Both Christians and then people who are not Christians and hate Christianity. And I'm always like, I always am more challenging the closed aspects and reminding people that there is more room than you think.
Yes.
And probably just about any worldview you can imagine.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's the beauty of diversity, right? And if you look around us, I think diversity is supposed to be there.
This beautiful earth?
Yeah, and people.
Yes.
Yeah, diversity is a good thing. And if it creates challenge for us, diversity, it asks us to grow, it asks us to adapt, I think that's good for us.
And getting back to this thing about responsibility and sex positivity, and I think one of the reasons that sex positive thinking is scary for some people. First of all, they think that means like I have to go do these sex acts I don't want to do. You don't get it.
No,
if that's
exactly.
your thinking.
Yeah, no.
There's asexuality as a part of
Yes.
in the sex positive movement.
Absolutely, yeah.
But there's this American tendency to not want to take responsibility.
Yes.
Maybe it's America's shadow, in a way, because we're so about go independent, do it on your own. But there's this shadow to America that doesn't want to be responsible for anything.
Yeah, and I think it's taking our independence too far. I
Yes.
do. I think it's selfish. I think we have forgotten about interdependence.
Yes.
You know, our independence is fine provided that we do have responsibility on the effect of our actions on others. We are interdependent.
Yes.
We are desperately dependent on our earth. We have forgotten our interdependent relationship with the earth. We have forgotten our interdependent relationship on each other. And it will be to our peril. It will be to our peril.
That's for sure.
And it
is right now.
It is right now. And it's happening in families when they forget about each other. Kids are relationships are breaking between parents and children, between parents and each other, because they forget about their relationship. I run an institute, and I think I've got, 15 therapists, in my institute that are they're all trained in individual, couple, family, sex therapy, and spiritual intimacy. There's only about 5% of therapists in the country that are trained that much. And they'll all tell you that their practices are filled with people that are working, 60, 70 plus hours a week. Well, when you're working that much, you're giving it all to your career and to your children, and you're not giving anything to your marriage. Your marriage is or your relationship, whether it's married or not, it's an organic entity. You ignore an organic entity.
It's another life that you've created, literally like another being.
Here in the Northwest, it will turn into a forest. It's going to get covered up in weeds. It's not going to do well. And you can pretend it will, but it won't. It's going to die. It's going to get choked out. And so this is just natural entropy, right? So, I think we have to remember our interdependence. And I think with sexuality and maybe with many things, it needs to honor self, it needs to honor other, and then it needs to honor our earth. too.
Right.
And if you believe in a relationship with a higher power, I think it needs to honor that too.
Yeah.
Because that's an important part of what you believe. So there's a authenticity, a congruence that needs to happen there for you to feel grounded in the earth and in the world.
Yep.
Yeah. And all you have to do is ask yourself those questions and then move forward.
And yeah, people are scared of what's inside.
Yeah, I think so.
Do you want to tell people about like your book or anything, any projects you're involved with that you'd like people to know about? Just like anything you want to plug?
Well, so I'm really proud of my book. So that's Sex, God, and the Conservative Church, Erasing Shame from Sexual Intimacy. It isn't just for people who grew up in the church. It's really for anybody that has experienced sexual shame at all. It's how America became a sex-negative culture. And it has in it how we became sex-negative, how we were absolutely meant to be sex-positive. It has a model for how you heal. And it has touch and non-touch practices in it. So you can actually know how to begin the process of bringing touch, integrated mind, body, soul touch into your life in a way that feels holistic and good. Because lots of times people just don't even know because they never got a chance to do it in a way that felt integrated to them. So I really wrote the book that people were asking for so often in my office.
And the book would be helpful, like you said, not just for people with the religious background, but if I think a lot of people want to understand what is going on in the world, in the country when it comes to moral majority, religious right, evangelical stuff. Mm-hmm. And your book can help people understand some of that too.
Yeah.
What's going on there.
Right. Yeah. It took 11 years to write.
Yeah.
It was one of the first books to come out that really took a hard look at all of it. And I wanted to understand it more too. So that's why I wrote it, and I'm really proud of it. So it's really kind of 3 books in one, even though it's not terribly long. It's pretty succinct. So there's that. And I have the Northwest Institute on Intimacy. So you can do instituteonintimacy.com or NWIOI.com. And that is an institute that trains all therapists and physicians to get training in sexuality and spiritual intimacy. What most people don't know is that you can go through all your training, whether it's a master's or PhD or MD, and only have to take 1 class in sexuality. Well, when you grow up in the United States and you have nothing in sexuality in your home, most people, and you get 1 class in your graduate studies, it means you can go to a couples therapist or an individual therapist or your physician, and they actually know about as much as you do, maybe a tad more. So we had no training institute in the Northwest at all. The closest one was Michigan, Massachusetts, Florida, very small one in California. So we actually started one here. And then on the website, we also have a place where we have therapists that are trained in all 5 areas. So you can go see them, and no matter where you go in your story, no matter what, they can follow you. They have no agenda as to how you need to heal. You get to direct it. And like I said, there's about 5% of therapists in the country that are trained this way. So many people know Esther Perel, and Esther is one of the few therapists that's trained this way too. So my next book is going to be a book that's been asked for, and it's going to be a parenting book, and it will walk people through their child's development around how they develop sexually, but it will have in each section also how it will trigger you as a parent, and then what you need to deal with your shame, like what's going to come up for you when they walk in on you, what's going to come up for you when they find their penis and find their clitoris, what's going to come up for you when they are found playing doctor, and then how you self-soothe yourself so that you can give your child what they need, and I'll tell you what your child needs too. So that way you can prepare for everything that's going to come down the road, and then what you're going to need to do for yourself. The way we change our own story is, and this is in the book, is you get yourself the education you need. You tell your own story so that you deal with your own shame. And then you deal with how you feel about your own body. And that begins to help change your own narrative so that we stop this shame narrative here at our generation, and we pass down a different generation to kids. And we can do that. We can do that in one generation, but we've got to do the work. So we've got to get the knowledge and the education, and then we've got to pass that education on to our kids. We know with countries like Sweden and Denmark and Holland and Finland that when you provide sex education at 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 at every year going on, what I call 100 1-minute conversations, just all the time, that kids actually get involved with sex later. They make safer sexual choices. They have more varied and dynamic and satisfying sex relationships as adults. But my favorite part of the research, they describe themselves as closer to their parents overall. And that's because the kids can know that they can trust their parents to talk about anything. Because if they can talk about sex with them, because they always have, then they can talk with them about anything. Because their parents are cool, right? They just don't get ruffled, right? So it's my goal is to really help people get comfortable around sexuality, because it's just like teaching them about their bladder or their stomach or their earlobes. It's just another part of being human. And it's a good part about being human. And most parents, if you ask them, do you want your child to grow up and have a good, intimate, loving relationship someday? They'll say yes. And then it's like, okay, so how do we help them develop that skill set?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's going to be great.
Yeah. So that's my next thing.
Awesome. Look forward to it.
Yeah. And for people that do want, do have a place where they need someone to come talk about sexual shame, I do a lot of speaking on that, and you can get me, my website is tinaschermersellers.com. So you'll probably have that in the notes. And I'm happy to come talk about sexual shame and how to get rid of it.
Thanks so much for talking about it right now.
Yeah.
And some movies.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. I want to thank my guest, Dr. Tina Schermer Sellers, for a absolutely fantastic talk. I don't know if you can hear in the background, but I'm actually in Mexico right now, and La Virgen de Guadalupe is being celebrated outside, and, there's music going on, but I have to record an outro to this show. But I really want to thank Dr. Tina Schermer Sellers for such a fantastic talk. If you go to the website, thetracepodcast.com, I'll have all the links to her book, all the work that she's involved in, and you can contact her if you're interested in hearing her speak, getting her book, all that kind of stuff. Anyways, one of my favorites that I've done here for The Trace. So once again, I'm Andrew Thomas Hackett. Thank you for listening. Love the neighbor, every neighbor, today.